Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming to this afternoon's Atlas Speaker Series. We are grateful to Edith Harrell-Caperton and Annette Harrell, whose generosity has supported this program. And through the Speaker Series, Atlas invites visionaries and innovators and leaders to come here and explore the ways that technology is used for learning and creating and exploring and shaping our society. And this spring, we have a series of speaker events that are up here, Exhibit A. And some wonderful speakers coming up. We have a wonderful speaker today. We only have wonderful speakers. So do grab a calendar of events on the way out. And I'm delighted to see so many people here on the first day back from spring break. Hi, Rita and Rita's class. It's nice to see all of you again, SCD2. I miss you from SCD1. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Revi Sterling, and I run the Master's Program in Information Communication Technologies for Development, where we focus on the uses of hardware and software to solve societal problems in underserved communities around the world. If you're interested in finding out more about the ICTD program, Exhibit 2 would be a flyer about that. So you can leave with all sorts of stuff to read and recycle once you're done. Hi, Luke. So, and today's talk is on information communication technologies for development. And I am so excited to have my dear friend and colleague, Mei Chang, here. It's hard to even start with Mei's accomplishments, although I'm going to try. So Mei is a reformed computer scientist. Okay, not really reformed. she gives me a hard time for not being one. But Mei graduated from Stanford and then had executive positions at SGI and Apple and Google. And at Google, she was in charge of the mobile development unit and the emerging technologies unit. Then she became a Franklin Fellow and worked at the U.S. Department of State, where she focused on gender and technology. And while she was there, started a whole bunch of initiatives that put her and I in touch for the through work for with UN Women and the State Department. Fun set of events and conferences that we were reminiscing on today earlier. During her time as a Franklin Fellow, she also started the Alliance for Affordable Internet, which is this amazing coalition of trade organizations and high-tech companies and NGOs and funding agencies like USAID that have all banded together to work to bring affordable broadband to communities all around the world and to bring affordable and to advocate for affordable internet policy. She's also a Henry Crown Fellow at the Aspen Institute. She's on the Grameen Foundation board. And now she is at Mercy Corps, where she's Chief Innovations Officer. So lots of stuff that we are going to hear from Mei about today, about the practices and policies and practicalities of using technology for development. And I think you're in for a real treat. So please welcome Mei.
Thank you so much, Revi. It's thrilling to be here. It's great to see this great turnout. Revi had told me everyone would be a little slow coming back from spring break, and so maybe no one would show up. But I'm glad to see people actually decide to come back to school. I come from the tech sector, and I worked in Silicon Valley for 23 years, and I only kind of started shifting in the last 2.5 years or so out of sort of pure private sector tech development. It's been an exciting journey. I had this dream for probably the last 20 years, or intent for the last 20 years. I was going to spend the first half of my career in the private sector and the second half in the public or social sector, trying to find something useful to do with all the skills I built up. And so I'm on that journey now. One of the things I had struggled with for much of those 20 years is like, how am I going to find anything useful to do with the skills I'm developing in the tech sector to actually do something useful in development, or to actually make the world a better place, because all I knew how to do was build software, right? And lo and behold, this whole sector of ICT for development sort of has sprung into existence in the last 5 years or so, and given me this great path to really be able to leverage some of the background and skills that I have in software development and technology to hopefully see how we can apply some of that to the development sector and solve some of the world's biggest problems. So I can't say I'm anywhere close to even having an idea how to do that, but I'm trying to learn more about it. So I'll kind of share some of what I've learned along the way. So the first thing I'd say is I think we're all excited here in the U.S. I live in Silicon Valley, right? And the mobile and internet revolution is omnipresent every minute of every day there, right? It's just such a a large amount of enthusiasm there, so much money sort of floating around there, chasing after the next big thing. And we're seeing just, tons of innovations coming out. And in the developed world, this is absolutely here, right? We're seeing like mobile and internet, transforming all of our lives. I mean, how I live my life day to day is completely different now. Whether I have a smartphone, I have the internet, I have Facebook. Like, this was not my reality when I was growing up. And I think there's this incredible promise that this is starting to change things in the developing world. There are maybe a few steps behind, but we can see it coming because we've experienced that ourselves here. One of the statistics that makes us excited about that is that soon there will be more than 5 billion mobile subscriptions, right? And that's like there'll be the same number of mobile subscriptions as there are people on this planet. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody in this planet is going to have a mobile phone, because how many people here have more than one mobile phone? Bunch of people. So a lot of people have more than one mobile phone. So when you hear like 7 billion mobile subscriptions, that's like, sometimes one person might have 2 or 3 or 4 mobile subscriptions. So that number's a little bit misleading, but what it means is that a high percentage of people actually have mobile phones. And we're seeing a lot, these bars are looking at different regions and sort of where, the number of connections in each of these different regions. And, certainly the highest one is in Asia because it includes these hugely populous countries of India and China. But you also see a pretty high bar for Africa in the orange there, right? That, even, when I go to Tanzania and I'm out on safari, I see the Maasai warriors with their cell phones strapped on their belt, right? It's like, it's become very pervasive. And even if people don't have their own phone, there's few people now who don't have access to a phone, from a family member or neighbor at this point. And so, I think that's one thing that's fueled this huge excitement that, hey, how do we leverage this new technology that's getting out there to the far reaches fast? More people have mobile phones in Africa than have clean water. Like, this has really proliferated. So how do we take advantage of that to solve some of the challenges we see there? So even though there's lots of phones out there, one thing to be cognizant of is in the United States, most people now have smartphones. That's still not the case globally. That'll be around 2016 when we expect that line to cross, where there's more smartphones than feature phones. So the phones that people generally have, especially in developing countries, are feature phones, which are the kinds of phones maybe we had 10, 15 years ago, which, you don't necessarily have internet access, or if you do, it's like, WAP-based, very minimal. So it's something to keep in mind. But we also see that trajectory changing very fast, that there's more and more people getting smartphones, connecting to the internet on their phones, even in developing countries, as those prices drop. And so why is that interesting? So the World Bank has published a study, which is very flawed in many ways, but I think directionally right, that says that for every 10% increase of mobile phones in a country, in developing countries in particular, it will drive a 0.81% growth in the economy. And for broadband access, if you increase broadband access in a country by 10%, it'll drive a 1.38% increase in the economy. Now, the numbers can't possibly be that precise, and they're going to vary a lot, but the idea is that when you have the mobile phones, when you have the internet, you can dramatically increase your own productivity. You can become much more efficient. You can, instead of walking 3 miles to pick up something or find out the price of something, you can just make a call before you take that walk. You can access markets, you can access information on better techniques for whatever you're doing. There's lots of things that help us be more productive. You can also access more markets, you can either locally or internationally. So being able to have access to all that information helps people be more productive and helps the overall society be more productive and drives economic growth. So there's a real belief that as we grow the penetration of mobile phones and the internet, and broadband internet is actually mostly happening in developing countries through mobile phones now, that can really be a driver for economic growth. The other thing that's really interesting is that the mobile internet adoption has been phenomenal. So this is comparing, there's a slide from Mary Meeker, and it's comparing sort of the adoption rate of different types of ICT technology. So if you look at the blue line is AM radio, and then TV, and then sort of broadband internet, and then mobile internet. And this mobile internet is not nearly at the same rate of penetration of these other technologies yet, but it's by far the steepest curve, right? So it's really spreading like wildfire around the world. So we see these numbers and we say, projection-wise, 7 billion people with mobile phones. mobile internet growing, smartphone penetration growing. So the question is, so why are there so few successes using technology for development? We hear a lot about, different pilot programs that are happening around to try to use mobile phones for improving health or education or financial services or entrepreneurship or civic engagement. But very, very few of these things have actually scaled so that they're impacting millions of people in multiple countries. Most of them are fairly small, isolated pilot programs. So why is that? Because the potential seems like it's there. So one example of sort of mass failure is this is a map of Uganda. And if you look at the red dots, these dots all represent pilot projects for mobile health, right? So this is only mobile health, it's only Uganda. There's a lot of red dots, none of them very big, right? So they're all very localized projects. Some NGO decided to go to this little community and try out some health thing. It was probably for one disease, maybe one's for HIV, one's for maternal mortality, and so forth. But what happens is you have this incredible splintering of lots of different little pilot programs, most of which are not designed to scale, most of which are not funded to scale, most of which are very sort of narrowly focused on, a very small community, a very small disease or problem. And you end up with this map that is nonsensical. Like each of these is a separate app. They don't talk to each other. They don't interface with each other. And the Ugandan government saw this and finally threw up their hands, and they actually issued an official moratorium where they said, thou shalt not create any more mobile health projects in Uganda. Like, this is making us crazy, because each of these things, we have to train the community health workers on this new app, and they have to get different type of phone, and they have to figure out how this other thing works. And then if they want to both do maternal mortality and HIV, they need two different things, and it's completely confusing, right? So the Ugandan government said, stop. This is insanity. Like, let's figure out a sensible way to do this before we kind of go forward. And this is, not at all unusual. Like, so whether it's, mobile agriculture or mobile financial services or mobile health in other countries or otherwise, this is not at all unusual that you see lots and lots of little pilot projects and very few of them getting to any scale and very few of them integrating with each other. Just a few other examples of things that haven't worked well. So this is an example of, a public school that, one of the things that we often like to do when we think about technology in developing countries is let's give computers to a school, right? So there's lots of these programs that say, let's, give computers, laptops, tablets, whatever to a school, because, hey, if kids have access to computers, they can do like really cool things, they'll learn better, they have access to new information and so forth. But what happens in most of these things is some, company, person, NGO, whatever, gets excited about donating all these computers, and they set them up and it looks great, and then they leave, and then things like decay rapidly, right? Like that people don't know how to fix the computers, they don't really, necessarily have the curriculum that's tied to the school, and soon after, a few years later, you go back and like none of the computers are working and nobody's using them, right? And so this is another sort of common failure case. The sort of offshoot of that is the one laptop per child, which maybe you guys have heard about, where, the idea was like, get every child this cheap laptop that looks kind of cool, and they will automatically figure out how to use it, and they'll automatically figure out how to get information and just educate themselves, right? We just get the laptops in children's hands. And it wasn't quite so easy. So they actually did a rigorous study in Peru and found that the kids who got these laptops didn't do any better than the kids who didn't get the laptops. And why was that? Is because, we get enamored at getting this hardware into people's hands, but there was not the same rigor or investment in figuring out how to get the software that actually tied into the school's curriculum, how to teach the teachers to use the laptop in the way that they taught and integrate it into their teaching. And so the laptops were just toys that kids would play with for a bit, maybe play some game or whatever, and then cast aside because it wasn't integrated into their normal work environment. So this is kind of what happens a lot of times with these development programs, is that they're designed to solve a narrow problem and not designed to solve the whole problem, and the narrow problem doesn't get solved by itself. Another example, which is not exactly an ICTD problem, but is indicative of some of the failures of development, is this tragic program called Play Pump that was widely hyped. Evidently, Barbara Bush was talking about this, and Steve Case, who founded AOL, was talking about this. We're gonna solve poverty by having kids play on this spinning wheel playground thing, and as the kids are just playing, they will generate energy to pump water from this borehole and be able to generate, pump up water instead of using hand pumps so that the community can have water, right? Sounds kind of cool, like, kids just playing, you just get water, like it makes a great story and a great picture, right? The reality of what happens is that, like, the kids, it actually took 27 hours of kids playing each day, so there's not 27 hours in the day, to generate enough energy to create the amount of water supply that you actually need. So what ends up happening is now, instead of using a hand pump that's designed to pump, like, you have women coming in and like trying to use this thing to generate water in a very inefficient way. It's, it's sort of humiliating for this woman to have to be, playing on the kids' playground in order to generate water. And there's all sorts of other issues. I mean, it just never was going to work because you could never generate enough energy, even in a day, if you played 24 hours a day. But they also didn't pay attention to other issues, such as, like, sometimes these boreholes would just run out of water. So, like, who cares that you have this fancy thing set up, but there's no water coming out, so it doesn't matter that you're pumping. And so a lot of this is, looking at, when we look at ICTD interventions, we need to think holistically about a problem, right? Not only, a lot of times our interventions, whether it's ICTD or otherwise in the developing world, tend to be very narrowly focused on something that we find very tractable, can make a good story, but doesn't look at the holistic environment in which it's operating in, and so therefore doesn't end up being sustainable, and doesn't end up making the impact that we want it to. So I just want to talk about 7 challenges that I've seen, and sort of in the ICTD space, of things that I see go wrong. And then we'll actually talk about some good news, because there is good news and there is promise. I don't want to be all doom and gloom. So the first question to ask is there actually a perceived need? Do people want something? This is the first question we should ask in general. The way development works is that aid agencies give an NGO money, NGO then gives something to the beneficiaries. But is that something they ever wanted in the first place? Did we ask them? So, this picture here is actually showing a bunch of people who are fishing with a mosquito net, because we gave them mosquito nets because we thought their problem is malaria, they need mosquito nets so they don't get malaria. The people thought their problem is that they're hungry and they need to catch more fish, right? So they went and used the mosquito net to go fishing. And so, we need to really understand the communities we're working in, what people's perception is of what they need versus what our perception is of what they need, because that's not always true. It's not always the same. One of the examples I give here is that, when we talk about getting more people online in developing countries, they often talk about, let's give them like great health information or tips on how to make their agricultural production more productive, or information on education, all these sort of things that are good for them. To me, it's like, go eat your spinach, right? And you know how people are about eating their spinach. It's like, we maybe should eat spinach, but how many of us actually do? I guess in Boulder it's kale, right? Eat your kale. That's not human nature, right? So in the United States, how did the internet develop? How did people come online? The reasons that people came online was largely for entertainment and communication. So how do most people in Africa come online? It's largely to use Facebook. That's the most popular way. It's not to get like health information. Like, maybe that's a side benefit you can get somewhere down the road, but it's not something that people are driven to want, right? And a big drive in the United States of getting internet proliferation was porn. To get more people online, provide porn. More people want to get online to see the porn, right? Much more likely than to get health information. And that's not to say we as development agencies should actually, promote porn. I'm not suggesting that. But what I am suggesting is that we need to really think about what people's motivations are, which are generally around the same kinds of desires and needs you and I have of entertainment and communication. We have a limited amount of tolerance to doing things that are good for us. And how do we really take that into account in terms of how we design things that we are providing people? The second thing I would say is, we need to ask, is the solution we're providing really usable? So how many of us actually used any services on our feature phones? Some of you may be too young to actually have had feature phones, but when you just had a 12-key keypad and a couple lines of text or whatever, how many of you took advantage of services? Probably almost none of us, right? But yet we're trying to give these services to people in developing countries. Somehow, by some miracle, they're going to find something useful that we never found useful. So one of the things we found at Google is that, you can do a search on a feature phone. Like you can type the characters, you have to hit the letter 3 times to get the letter and all that stuff, if you guys remember that. So you can sort of do a search and you can sort of display some information. But if you have a smartphone, people will do 50 times as many searches, right? Because it's just easier. And you can actually see something more useful on the other end. So it's just painful to do some of this stuff on a feature phone, even though it's possible, right? It's incredibly painful to install an app, a Java app, on your feature phone. Most of us probably couldn't figure out how to do it if no one had told us. So even though these things are possible, we have to be realistic about, is it actually usable for people, especially people who have much lower levels of digital literacy than we do. There's been studies that show that even though you can send out SMS messages, it seems easy, that women actually prefer calling. That the sort of more personal, that an SMS seems very impersonal, and that having the personal touch of actually hearing someone's voice will be much more, make the message much more interesting to them. Or something like mobile money, which, is like, oh, well, let's make people pay for buses on mobile money. But you actually have to hit quite a number of buttons, and you have to hit your PIN code and everything. And you're just standing there on the bus, and everyone's waiting to try to get on. It doesn't work very well, right? So we just need to be practical about things in terms of how they're really going to be used, and is it going to be something that people will want to use, not just be possible to do. One of the things that Remy mentioned I worked at at the State Department is, whether you actually have access to data and is it affordable. So here we take data for granted, right? That there's a signal most everywhere we go. It's actually reasonably affordable. So most of us have access to data. In rural areas of Africa, which is a lot of where development projects tend to focus, only 50% of the rural population has actual coverage. So they don't have a signal that they can get mobile data where they are, and so they have to maybe go somewhere else to get it, or it's intermittent or whatever. And so we need to take that into account in designing our solutions. And even if they have a signal, the internet costs are dramatically higher, especially when you look at it based on relative to incomes. So in the US, we're something like 1% of average monthly income is what we spend to get an internet connection, right? So it's like, maybe it's $50 a month or something like that. Something that's a relatively small percentage of our income, even though we still feel like it's expensive. It's something that's relatively affordable to most people. In developing countries, the average is 31%. It's much worse in Africa. It's over 50% of average monthly income, right? So is someone going to spend 50% of their income on an internet connection? Not very likely. And so when we think about, oh, let's use ICTs to help people in rural areas, like, do they have enough income that they can actually afford data? Like, do they actually have coverage? Are they literate enough to actually be able to read whatever message you're going to send them? These are things that we need to consider in terms of using mobile phones for a mobile app or an SMS service actually practical in those spaces. So 4. There's also the digital divide. So this is from a study that Intel did called Women in the Web that came out last year. And in the developing countries, what they found is that there's 23% fewer women online. And so that's a lot fewer women that are online. So if you're creating a service that's online, a lot fewer women get it. And this is particularly bad in certain areas. So for example, in Africa, it's 43%. So what that means is there's nearly twice as many men online as women. So if you're going to offer a service that requires people to be online, you're going to reach twice as many men as women, in Africa at least. And so that's something we need to consider in designing our projects. Is that our intent? If we want to reach twice as many men, that's a great way to go. But if not, how are we going to work with that to actually reach the whole population? And so, why is there this gender gap? Affordability is a problem that impacts women much more than men, just because women tend to have lower incomes in developing countries in particular, and also, even with the incomes that they often have less control of their spending. There can be real cultural barriers, particularly in Muslim-majority countries and in South Asia, where women are discouraged from or even prohibited from using mobile phones because, or the internet, because there's ideas culturally that could lead to promiscuity. So their brothers or their husbands or their fathers won't let women actually use mobile phones. There's issues around digital literacy. Women often are just not as comfortable trying out new technologies. And this isn't because women are not as good at new technologies. My theory about this is that, men, there's an overgeneralization, I think, like to tinker with things. Like, if you put a radio in front of like a boy and a girl, the boy might take apart the radio and see how it works inside. The girl might just turn the radio on and like listen to the music. Because I think women tend to be a little bit more practical. That, they have a lot of responsibilities, to bring in income, to feed their children, to take care of stuff in the household. And they don't have time to like just tinker with things. They're much more practical. If like the radio's broken and they need it, then they're going to fix it. But if it's not broken, they're not going to take it apart because they don't have time to do that. And so because of that, I think women tend to explore a little less unless it's something that they feel like it's going to serve a practical need of theirs. And so we need to show women how ICTs may actually improve their lives, and then I think they can be really fast adopters of it. My mom actually was afraid of computers and the internet for the longest time, and now she won't take phone calls from me. She just wants emails. She's like, don't bother me. Like, I'll get back to you when I get to email. There's also, today most of the people who are creating content and services are men. Most engineers are men, and who's creating this stuff is men. And so, not surprisingly, the things that are created are more geared towards men. And they may not be like male specific, but they are just designed people naturally design stuff for themselves, so they can see how they would use something. And so there's less stuff that's actually relevant or appropriate for women. There's lower literacy levels for women, which also impacts their ability to be able to benefit from online services and SMS services. And online harassment can actually make women feel very uncomfortable sometimes. It's not a safe space for them to go online. So, fifth challenge, scaling awareness. This is a huge challenge, right? I mean, one of the reasons that you see all those little dots in Uganda is like, it's incredibly expensive to, like, how do you let all these people in remote rural areas know about your special short code that you're supposed to type in order to get information, or where your URL to download your web app? I mean, it's not like these people just are on the internet and you can just send emails to them all and tell them this, right? So it's very expensive to scale awareness. The best way to do so is through a carrier deal. It's very, very hard to get carrier deals. But when you get a carrier deal and you can be on the carrier dock and integrate it into the phone, that's one of the best ways to get distribution. But it's really hard to get that, and most of these projects aren't able to get that. And so the question is, how do you actually scale? And how can we start thinking about platforms so that, how can we leverage other platforms? Like, instead of getting a new short code for your particular service, why not deliver, if you have health information service that somehow you have to let all these millions of people in far-flung remote areas know about, why not piggyback on Facebook? Because all these people are on Facebook. Why not actually send your messages out over Facebook and they can share it with their friends? Leverage sort of existing platforms where you can. So 6, I don't know if people recognize this picture. This is healthcare.gov. Hopefully not anymore. So the question is, how simple can you start in terms of building this stuff? We were talking earlier at lunch, and I think that when you look at ICT projects that are being done, I think 80% of the work that's being done is reinventing a wheel. Everyone's creating the same code to send out SMSs and get messages back and do all, parse all this stuff and everything. And so we're just reinventing the wheel over and over again. And 20% of that is actually your value add. So it's very hard to innovate that way. And you're also, that 80% you're reinventing is not very solid or stable because it hasn't been tried and tested. So what if we instead take advantage of platforms that are out there already? Get that 80% from something other people have done before and packaged up to be used as a platform. It can be sort of something like Facebook, where you can just ride on top of and put your messages on, or it can be some of these, lower level systems like, Motec or OpenMRS, where it's open source code that you can kind of build on top of. But one way or another, this keeps you from reinventing the whole wheel and be able to focus on your value add. And not only focus on your value add, but be built on something that's much more solid, much more scalable, that's been hardened by many, many people building stuff on top of it, and will continue to be maintained and improved. So finally, last one I have is, do we understand the costs? So, at Google, when we started a project, maybe we'd have 5 engineers on it, and then we'd shift the project, and usually after we shift the project, we'd grow the team. At an NGO, what happens is you start a project, you go outsource it to some contract firm or something, consulting firm, and then they deliver your project, and you're like, contract done, goodbye, right? It doesn't really work that way, because what happens is that once you actually finish your project, there's so much more to do. You have to train people, you're going to get feedback, there's going to be feature requests, there's going to be things that don't work quite right, there's going to be transitions in technology. And the biggest one that I would say is maintenance. Maintenance is like absolutely key, that it costs a lot to maintain your program. You're going to discover bugs all the time, you're going to discover new features you need to add. And so we need to design ICT projects such that when we actually are done shipping them, we're actually at least staying at the same level of staffing, if not staffing up, if we pay attention to sort of what happens in industry. If we staff down the project, that's why you end up with a little small dot, right, is that you just can't keep growing it that way. Okay, so now the good news. So there are some things that have worked, and I think there's a lot of potential for things to work if we kind of shift the way we go about doing ICT for D. So one example you guys may have heard of is M-Pesa, right? So this wasn't even an ICTD project. It was a for-profit project by Vodafone or Safaricom in Kenya. It's phenomenal. I spent three months in Kenya last year, and like everybody has M-Pesa, like pretty much everyone. I think right now they're up to 40% of the GDP of Kenya going through M-Pesa. It's like really phenomenal, and it's great because you can just pay people. Like I had a gardener who was taking care of my yard when I was there, and it was hard for me to connect up with him, so I just pay him over M-Pesa. You can pay for your coffee with M-Pesa when you go to the coffee store. It's a phenomenal way to be able to transfer money. And I guess I haven't updated this yet, but I think it's now over 40%. And now what we're trying to do is replicate this in other countries. It hasn't gotten the same traction in other countries yet as it has in Kenya, although we're starting to see good traction in places like Tanzania and Zimbabwe and some other places. But it's hard. But this is a great success and has enabled a huge amount of stuff, and I think really been a driver for economic growth. Sort of on the other extreme, this is Jokko Community Farm was a project in Senegal, and this is really trying to understand how the local culture works and how to fit what you're doing to local culture. So these branches that you see on the ground are somebody trying to explain the menu structure of a feature phone to these women so that they can figure out how to actually navigate things. And what they did was they used mobile phones as a supplement to literacy training. So they're training women to be literate, and they would let them practice their literacy skills by texting to each other. And so they were teaching them how this works in a way that they could relate to. And then they found that by using mobile phones to text each other, and this is not, they don't have to discover some other service or whatever, but they could just share stuff. It was very social too, that they could practice their typing and their literacy skills, and that would help them have better results. Another example I like is Grameen Foundation, which I'm on the program committee of. They have a program called Community Knowledge Workers, and these are sort of like agricultural extension workers, so people who work with farmers. They're farmers themselves, and they're selected from their communities, and they work with farmers to help them with information services. And the way this works is rather than trying to figure out how to have every farmer in these like rural communities, again, a lot of whom are illiterate, and a lot of who don't have data access or whatever, what they did was something really smart, is that they took these farmers who were leaders in their communities, brought them in to train them and equip them with a mobile phone. So they gave them like a low-end smartphone. They trained them on how to use it. And you could do this when it's like 1 in 100 farmers and you don't have to train every farmer, or maybe 1 in 1,000 farmers. I forget what the ratio is. But by using these intermediaries, they can more effectively train a small set of people who are a little bit better educated, a little bit better equipped, to then go into the communities and have at their fingertips access to all this information so that they can look up when somebody says, how should I plant my corn? They can look up, oh, this is the best practice of how to plant your corn, and then share that information with people. And they can have little videos that they can show and so forth. So it's like disintermediating it a little bit because, it's very sexy, the idea that we're going to have every last person have access on their phone, but sometimes it's not practical. We've also also found that, Grameen found that, when you send text information messages to people, they might actually get them and read them, but it's very rare that they actually change their behavior. Because how many of us change our behavior because we got a text message? It's just not very likely, right? But when they actually have a community health worker show up at the doorstep, talk to them, it's much more personal, they're much more engaged with it, and that community health worker may get their information from a mobile application. People are much more likely to actually change their behavior because they're talking to a person. They can digest that information much more. It's much more personal. Sort of the last example I'll give is Mobile Mama, which is a coalition that has been working, State Department's been involved with it, lots of different organizations have been involved in trying to pull together best practices around distributing information about maternal and newborn health care. And what they do is they will let you choose to either receive an SMS message or to receive a voice message for your tips. So when you go to the doctor and they tell you you're pregnant, they register you, and then you get these tips every week that tell you what's happening with your baby at the time and how they're developing, what you should be doing now, when you should go back to the doctor. And they found it to be quite effective. And one of the reasons it's effective is that the medium by which they share the messages is chosen by women. So, for example, women in Bangladesh, they found, were, I think 98% were getting voice messages because literacy rates were low there. It was just more personal that they could get it. And so that was a medium that worked for them. Whereas in Africa, they found a much higher percentage of women choosing SMS because there's a little bit more familiarity with SMS. I think the pricing was a little bit better there as well. The other really great thing about Mama is it's pulling across lots of NGOs, so they're one time figuring out the right content. So they're getting the best experts around the world of what's happening with your kid at every stage. This is a very universal thing. Kids don't develop any differently in different countries. And being able to share those best practices with all the agencies that are trying to do this. So in the agriculture or health space, a lot of the time each NGO sort of tries to rediscern a set of messages or a set of tips, but this is trying to centralize that so people don't have to reinvent that wheel, and they can actually leverage those messages and figure out the best way to distribute them. So one of the cool things that's happening is there's this group that I've been involved with while I was at State and continue to work with that's led by USAID, the World Bank, Gates Foundation, DFID, a few other groups, UNICEF, that have been working on trying to figure out how do we codify best practices and work across across all the different players and all the funders in particular who are trying to fund ICT for development and try to get everyone to reinforce these best practices, to agree to adopt them on their own and agree to reinforce them in their funding. And so there's some great movement across the industry right now to try to normalize some of these things. And this is sort of a brief synopsis. There's sort of a two-pager that is getting circulated around right now, just trying to codify these kind of best practices that hopefully all the different agencies will adopt so that at least we start doing things that are a little bit more sensical and hopefully will be more likely then to lead to success. And these are things that maybe seem obvious, but just haven't happened in a lot of programs, at least not all together. So, things like really designing with the user in mind, as opposed to something like Play Pump. Integrating with the existing ecosystem so things actually speak to each other rather than work in silos. So I won't read through all of them, but there's also an effort to try to pull together something called a mobile hub to try to bring together a new agency or institution of some sort, organization of some sort, to try to be a central clearinghouse for common good things. So whether that's common infrastructure or best practices, disseminating any information, trying to aggregate, distribution of short codes or things like that. There's an effort to try to pull together a bunch of organizations to work together on creating this kind of mobile hub. So it's still a work in progress. But it's an exciting idea because then, as everyone wants to try to do something new, they can kind of leverage resources that will tell them what are the best practices in this space today. What are resources that you can use to, be able to get you 80% of the way there, and then you can innovate on top of that. And hopefully then better focus some of the efforts that we've had out there, and also create some standards and also incentivize funders to be able to fund some of these infrastructure programs, which are very, very important in platforms, but that just aren't as sexy, and so people don't fund them as much. So in practical terms, what I'd say is carrier deals are really important. They're also really hard to get. Intermediaries, I think, are something that we don't think enough about in terms of how do we distribute the information and access. So especially when you're in low resource environments, intermediaries can be a much better way to reach your end user. Look at things, commercial platforms are out there like Facebook and YouTube to actually distribute things rather than creating your own channel that then people don't know about. Really important is to, try not to rebuild technology that already exists. Try to find whatever ways to build on top of existing platforms. And the reality is few NGOs really have internal tech capacity. And so, one of the challenges is how do we build technology in organizations that don't really know how to? So some organizations, including Mercy Corps now, are trying to build up some internal tech capacity so that we have the expertise to make better decisions around this stuff. Folks like Grameen, FHI's 360, and UNICEF are some of the exceptions that are kind of leading the way there. But I think that there's a lot of, people are starting to think about this being a more and more important tool that every organization should have at their disposal. And that is all I have, so I am happy to take questions. Yes?
So I have a question related to one of your best practices, which I support, which is addressing security and privacy. Mobile phones generate huge amounts of geolocated personal information. It strikes me that we really don't know how to address security and privacy in the developed world, let alone in places where users are less sophisticated in managing their own digital footprint.
Uh-huh.
What do you think?
I agree.
So how do we address security?
Yeah, so I don't have a simple answer for how you address the security. It's something that we need to think about with each application that we build or each service that we build sort of what are the security requirements of what we're doing. So, we're doing work in Syria right now, and it's a very, very tenuous security situation, where the government can monitor your communications, and so you have to be very, very careful about what you might send of any regard. But if you're sending health information tips and it's just one-way information, maybe you don't have to worry so much about security, right? If everyone's just getting generic health tips, it doesn't reveal any personal information. So I think you have to gauge sort of what's appropriate for the particular application that you have. And one of the reasons I'm excited about the mobile hub is the idea that each of the NGOs that are building these things don't have the resources to possibly understand and solve these security problems for each individual deployment. And so this is one of the things I think needs to have more research and investment made centrally to try to address so that we can all kind of share the benefit of that. Yeah?
I have another best practice question, and that was that you said there seems to be more success with developing for intermediaries. And I was wondering if you could give an example or tell a story about that.
Sorry.
You said develop for intermediaries rather than end users.
Uh-huh.
I was wondering if you could give an example or tell a story about that.
Yeah, so the Grameen Foundation Community Knowledge Workers is one example, like for agriculture. This also happens with health workers, right? I can't think of a program off the top of my head, but there's a bunch of systems that are put in place where you train health workers, and they have patient data records on their mobile phone and access to diagnosis information, so they can ask certain questions and get the answer and have sort of a decision tree on their phone to be able to try to diagnose what the problem is. And again, that's been shown to be more effective than trying to get the end user to figure that out themselves. Even though in theory you could do it, in practice it becomes a little impractical. Yeah?
When reading on companies like Facebook to build an app on or whatnot, a problem that I find is that the access to data is limited unless you have a collaboration with Facebook to access all that data. How would you propose working around that if you're wanting to get more into analytics?
What kind of data do you want to access?
Just, like a certain group's user data and their network and how they're growing, how they're expanding, how their patterns of use.
Yeah, so I think there's certain data that Facebook does release publicly, right? So you can get, for example, there's sites where you can get data on the number of women and men using Facebook in any country, which is how I kind of approximated what the gender divide looked like before we had the Intel study. But I think that, and there's a lot of things you can do on Facebook on the public interfaces without having to have a relationship with Facebook. So if you just want to create a group and anyone who subscribes to the group can get access to information that you're putting out about health or agriculture or whatever, that's something you don't need to, you don't need to have a relationship with Facebook. But there may be other things that you want to do that are a little bit more deeper than that, where a partnership with Facebook may make sense. And I think Facebook is starting to look at this more with their Internet.org initiative. They're really starting to think about how do we, they're realizing, I mean, Facebook is the biggest by far service that's used in developing country. They're realizing their responsibility and their interest in this, and so I think they're starting to invest more there, and I think you'll see more engagement from Facebook on that front. Yeah?
So you mentioned that, I think accurately, that a lot of NGOs don't have a ton of tech capacity, which I imagine is difficult coming from Silicon Valley. But so in my experience, there's often problems sort of integrating technology in sort of old school development disciplines. Have you had any like challenges or successes in terms of getting Mercy Corps to think about technology like as like a central point of some of their sectors that they might not have had in the past?
Yeah, so I've only been at Mercy Corps for 5 months, so I haven't been there really long enough to have successes or failures. But I'm sure I will have both. I've spent most of the first 5 months just traveling around getting to know the organization and our programs. But what I've seen in sort of looking at a bunch of other NGOs is that there isn't a tech understanding there, right? So a couple things happen. One is that there's this pass-through, this really terrible pass-through that happens where the funder has some program, and then the NGO has writes a proposal, and there usually no one on either side knows anything about technology. And then they sort of agree on something that includes a mobile app because that's the cool new thing to do, right? And then they hoist this off on some unwitting developer or consulting firm and says, "Can you build me this thing?" And the thing makes absolutely no sense, right? And so that's sort of like the worst case scenario of how some of this stuff works. And I've seen this happen even when I was at State. And so I would turn your question around a little bit, because I would say that I'm not trying to integrate technology into our programs, right? I'm not trying to say, hey, you need to have a mobile app in your program. What I'm trying to do is get people to recognize where they are, what they're doing, and where they're running into problems. Either it's too expensive to do something, or they're not reaching people, or it's they're writing stuff down on paper and pencil to monitor stuff, and they're losing the pieces of paper, or whatever the problems are, and really get them to identify those problems. And where technology ends up being a solution that can help them, we're trying to help suggest the things that the tools that they can take advantage of. But not, I don't think that every program should have a tech component to it. But I think that we're trying to educate the people across our field to understand better what tools are out there, so that they can, at least when they have a problem, pick from that toolbox in addition to the ones that they have today. Yeah, back there.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the talk. Noah Finkelstein. I'm in physics and in the Center for STEM Learning here, and I think a lot about the nature of education here throughout our system, and a lot of these best practices really resonate. Certainly sustainability and scalability I find to be very similar in the challenges in educational transformation. And we think a lot about the nature of technology in those environments. And one thing that I found really helpful, if you forget the long intro here to the question, I do have one, is to think about social systems themselves as a technology, how humans interact with each other, as constructed forms of technology. And then we can see how these different technologies interact, whether they're information technology tools or not. And that was sort of the example that you had in this sort of tree diagram and structure of women learning in the mobile app. So I found that to be very productive, to see how then these new tools sit within the broader ecological landscape of what goes on. And to that end, that leads me to the question, which is, in education, one of the key tools that's been very productive is the use of design-based research or action research, where you go and partner with particular programs, university partners with schools or teachers. Is there this sense that there's a partnership not only in the deployment and use and sustainability, but in fact in the creation of these various technologies?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it needs to start, when you say start with the user, like it needs to start with the design, right, in terms of like what is the problem you're trying to solve and what will people relate to, what will they want to use. And so, we just hired a user research designer on our team to help with that type of process. It's just sort of a start of that. And we're working with organizations like IDEO. We're working on a program in the Philippines now where we're engaging IDEO to try to really understand the user desires and needs. And I think it's the development world is starting to recognize more and more the importance of that. But I think it's still a little hit and miss right now. But absolutely important.
I mean, so the example, just to follow on, the example there, the Grameen program, where you have the farmer. In fact, I think the real technology is having that farmer, that lead farmer, now being able to access and service a portal, and then I suspect gives as much information back to the development of the tools that are necessary.
Absolutely.
There, so it's in the construction, not only then in the deployment.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I totally agree. Yeah.
I'm curious about the second digital divide.
Uh-huh.
And how do you think that could even begin to be addressed? It seems like such a huge problem stemming from the low literacy rates of women. And what are things that you think would help to start to bridge that divide?
Yeah, it is not an easy problem to solve because some of the problems are very systemic, right? So, one of our colleagues would say that almost all of that digital divide is based on non-specific factors related to technology, but just the fact of lower literacy, lower incomes, and so forth. How do we sort of equalize the status of women around the world? That's something many people are working on. And there's lots of efforts that are trying to educate girls more, and we've seen huge progress in that in the last few decades. So those things will help, but they help very slowly. You don't educate people overnight. Things like affordability. The reason I actually started the Alliance for Affordable Internet, which actually has nothing to do with women, is that it came from sort of looking at this problem and saying, what are the biggest barriers? And affordability being one of the biggest barriers for women and a much bigger barrier than for men, and thinking, well, if we can get the price of mobile phones down and the price of internet access down, that women will benefit disproportionately, right? But it's not an easy problem to solve, right? You can't solve the affordability problem at scale by giving out a lot of phones or free access time because it's just way too expensive. And so, the Alliance for Affordable Internet is actually bringing together this coalition to apply pressure to governments to reform policy and regulations that will lead to better market competition and market efficiencies, which will then lead to lower prices, which then will lead to more access and hopefully more women getting online. But that's a very long process, right? So none of these things have easy solutions. There are many programs that sort of do sort of quick and dirty solutions where they get more women online in a particular community by giving them phones or doing a digital literacy training or so forth. But those things are not very scalable. I know Intel, as part of their what is the program called? I don't know. There's a program that they're doing that was their CGI commitment last year that follows on the Women in the Web report. She will connect. And what they're doing is they're trying to create an online kind of digital literacy training that's like gamified, that makes it more engaging for people to try to learn basic digital literacy skills, because digital literacy is another barrier. So, I kind of list the barriers. None of them are very easy to bridge, but they all take time. But I really believe in trying to tackle those systemic issues rather than kind of putting Band-Aids over little tiny segments of populations. Yeah.
So when we talk about funding, and you talked a lot about not reinventing the wheel and let's build on each other's projects, the funding environment is very competitive, and so we don't want to look as if, well, I'm going to copy your idea and then get some funding for it. And then also in terms of things like, being able to fail a little bit, kind of having a bit of a rapid innovation cycle where we could maybe try some things and share them with others. But I'm just worried that maybe the competitive funding environment may not allow for that. But maybe with that best practices.
I think you're right. I think the funders have been a big part of the problem up to now, and it's one of the reasons I'm very excited about this initiative that's been bringing funders together to try to look at sort of the failures in ICTD in particular as a sort of starting point, because the problem isn't only in ICTD, it's across the board. But it's a place, because of the innovation nature of it, that it's a little bit more tractable. And so I think the funders are starting to wake up to the issue, and they very much are the drivers of a lot of the issues. That said, I think there's things that people can do on the recipient side, right? So, when you talk about that it's hard to fund reinventing the wheel to just pitch someone else's program, you don't have to just pitch someone's program. You can improve on it, right? But building on their base and going beyond that, to me, makes a lot more sense than saying, oh, I'm just going to reinvent what they did, right? Not all funders recognize that, and there's this perverse incentive whereby reinventing the wheel, you can say it's going to cost more money, and so you can get more money, and people are always trying to get more money. So the incentives are wrong for that, and that's what we're trying to change with the funders, so they actually incentivize people to leverage existing platforms rather than incentivize people to rebuild stuff.
And then I'm thinking too about from recipient to recipient, of just improving those relationships too, so that we're not.
Yeah, so it's more collaborative, right? And I really believe in sort of collaborative coalitions going together to get funding where we can leverage each other's strengths. And your point about the innovation piece is also a really good one, that the way funding is set up, the funding sort of validates an idea just by the fact that you got funding, but it doesn't actually mean that the thing works, right? And so we're seeing more discipline getting put in place. It's still very early stages right now, but you're seeing things like DIV, which is the Development Innovation Ventures from USAID, that's trying to tranche up money that's more like how private sector money comes in. So they'll give you like $100,000 to test out an idea, but you have to get metrics that show that you were able to provide whatever benefit for less money or more effectively than what's being done out there. And then if you are, then they'll give you like $1 million to kind of scale up, and then they'll give you $5 million to scale up from there, versus today where you get the $5 million up front and you just scale up whatever you have, right? So it doesn't make very much sense. So that tiering up helps. And then there's also things like results-based financing, which I'm a big fan of, where you actually you bid to say, I want $90 per whatever, infant I save or girl I get through high school. And then you get paid based on the number of infants you save or girls you get through high school. And you can be competitive that way to try to be more efficient with your intervention. But it is hard, and I think even one of the things I'm trying to push at Mercy Corps is the idea that in these big grants that we get these like $40, $50 million grants sometimes. Like, what if we just set like a carve out that's like 1%? Because innovation isn't expensive; it's the scaling that's expensive. So we did like a 1% carve out in our grant proposal. That's an innovation fund. That's deliberately to quickly and cheaply test and iterate the different ideas that we might then scale, right? It's a small percentage at that point, so it shouldn't have a material impact on the overall program success. But that small percentage, you can actually test out a lot of stuff and make the overall program much more effective.
That's really good to hear. I mean, I think that's, and if funders can start accepting that as part of the process.
I think there's starting to be a recognition, but it's not mainstream yet. Yeah?
Since you're at state and one of their agendas is democracy and governance, I'm wondering if there's any explicit analysis or promotion of mobile technology for social or political movements.
There is. I'm not at state anymore, but there have been a lot of things. Ushahidi, which I mentioned in one of the slides, has done a lot of stuff in terms of, like, when I was in Kenya, monitoring the Kenya elections, letting people be able to speak up about improprieties they see in the elections and otherwise. There's been a lot of sort of citizen engagement type stuff. It's not an area I'm deeply familiar with, but there's definitely a lot of interest and work happening in that space.
Time for one more question? You used healthcare.gov as an example of an ICTD project, and I had never approached it that way, but it makes perfect sense that it is. And there are any number of those best practices that were failed to consider, or apparently so many. What was the biggest blunder? What was the biggest mistake there? Is there any recovery from that? I mean, looking at it through your lens.
I'm not intimately familiar with what happened in healthcare.gov. There's a great article in Time magazine that sort of goes through the whole process of what happened. One of the issues is that this sort of separation of ownership, where ownership gets diffused, right? So the federal government contracted out 3 or 4 different consulting firms. They have to bid out these competitive bids and take the best bid, which isn't necessarily the best implementer. And then they all get carved out different pieces that they're supposed to do, but there isn't the same accountability or ownership that you have when it's your thing, right? And so I would read the Time magazine article because it goes into a lot of detail, but I think the way that it gets set up in the way that pieces get sort of distributed out and there isn't this sense of ownership or accountability is a big problem in kind of how these things get done. And it's part of the government procurement system that's really broken.
Well, I want to say thank you so much to Ann Mei and everybody for coming after spring break. These are hot off the press from IRA. These are a new and updated events calendar for Atlas. And one thing I want to point out is that in a few days, on Wednesday, we'll have the Atlas Masters Spring Practicum presentations. And 3 of our students who are here today, Hara and Alexis and Aaron, do you want to wave so we can all look at you and Cool. We'll be doing their practicum presentations here Wednesday at 4 p.m. Also, we have an all-day Atlas Kickstarter workshop happening in a few weekends, so please take on the way out. Ann May will be here for another 15 minutes before I Zoom her to DIA, so if you didn't get your question asked, please come up afterwards. And thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks,